Part 6. In Western Garb. Sufis in the West. Question. Surely your importation into the West of Oriental ideas through Sufi thought and literature must be seen only as the invasion of a foreign system, like the recent introduction of Hindu, Buddhist and Chinese ones, and nothing of permanent influence. If the Sufi forms and concepts indeed had the power to penetrate Western thought, surely they would have done so long ago. Answer. I do not know what you mean by long ago. It is true, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, that the word dervish appears in the language only in 1585, as the word fakir, originally Arabic for the Persian dervish, as late as 1609, and the term Sufi came here in 1653. Sufism itself is first found in the 19th century. This currency, however, is already far earlier than many of the intellectual and other concepts which are in the mainstream of Western thought, and earlier than recent Oriental imports. But we have hardly started. Ghazali, died 1111, the great Sufi of Iran, was so influential with the European, including English, medieval thinkers that he was actually imagined to be an eminent Christian theologian, while Roger Bacon was teaching Sufi ideas at the University of Oxford soon after its foundation. The Franciscans, Dante, Chaucer, and many of the Western mystics of many centuries ago have been shown by European scholars themselves to have depended upon Sufi materials. In some cases, they actually copied from Sufi textbooks. I do not think that there is any parallel to this ancient presence of historical Sufism in the West in any of the Oriental systems you mention. We build on that foundation, plus the present state of Western society and thought. What the Orientals are doing, it is up to them to display and assert. As for my introducing Sufi ideas, you should remember that there is an astonishingly large number of books and monographs studying Sufism, entirely prepared by Western scholars, centuries before I brought these materials to the West. My activity is not introduction, but explanation and updating. Sufi activity, it could be claimed, has been rooted in the West for longer than most ideas which are said to be Western. Reasons. Question. What is the reason for the way in which your materials are projected in print? I mean, why do you translate some material, represent other portions, use Eastern similes in some, and Western psychological terminology and insights in others? Answer. There are two criteria. 1. What materials have to be projected at the present time to have the maximum useful effect? And 2. Who can absorb them and in what format? Sufic materials are always presented in accordance with the possibilities. This is because Sufism is not archaeology or hagiography, however much it may resemble them to those who look no further, but effect. Eastern similes which are still viable both in the East and West are used because of this viability. Superseded materials are not regurgitated just because they have been used in former times. Materials are represented if this can be usefully done. Western psychological terminology and insights are useful, so they are used. Look at the results. The published materials are read and accepted in both the East and West, by scientists as well as theologians, by ordinary readers in addition to specialists of all kinds. In a word, the presentation is effective. If there were no originating impulse from which the material comes, and which indicates how it may be used, we would be forced to present Sufi materials like you would any other dead corpus of law, You would rearrange, prune, and present in accordance with subjective assessments. We do not have to do this, since the material itself provides the guidance to those who can descry it. The question, however, illustrates the mind of the questioner more than anything else, for it presupposes that Sufi materials are like those of any other pursuit, capable of being manipulated by rule or whim. Had the questioner taken into consideration the Sufi fact that the teaching determines its method of presentation, he would not have needed to ask the question. Folk memory. Question. Traditions die hard, and folk memory retains many truths which are not known by scholars. Is it not worth investigating the psychological and mystical procedures of supposedly primitive peoples for forgotten knowledge? Answer. First, forgotten by whom? I am not aware of any psychological and mystical knowledge being needed, and hence sought for retrieval from anyone until the existing materials have been used. Your question is the same as the old one about inventing the wheel. Someone who knows nothing about the wheel may start to question whether there is perhaps not such a tradition in some primitive region. But has he or she asked the engineers if they ever heard of it? Secondly, folk knowledge is two-sided. Some of it is supposed to go back thousands of years. Very well. Now, look at this. The problem is who or what the clock, which is over 50 years old, commemorates. One group of historians are adamant that it was erected in 1916 as a war memorial, whereas another group assure me it commemorates the discovery of pasteurized milk. In 62 years or so, even scholars can't agree why a public clock was put up in Britain. The third point, of course, is the historians. Who is to do this investigating of the folk memory? Only people who know what they are looking for, not just another group of scholars who will disagree with one another. Our enterprise is experiential, which means, among other things, that what is discovered is factual and not susceptible to varying explanations. Men are not rats. When Pavlov showed that dogs could be conditioned, one retort of the time was, "Men are not dogs." Be that as it may, social and drinking habits among men, in the West at any rate, have been shown in the laboratory to resemble the behavior of rats rather closely. The psychologist Gaylord Ellison has demonstrated that when rats are offered alcohol, recreation, and food, in circumstances similar to those afforded man, they tend to adopt similar forms of behavior. The importance of this study is that it helps to approach the question of whether social and cultural behavior is in fact derived from the animal side of man. Within a few days of being put into their human-type setting, the rats developed patterns which mimic those of Western people. They went to the alcohol dispensers, as do Europeans and Americans, at a pre-meal cocktail hour. Concurrently, again as with humans in a similar situation, they combined this with social activity. Although the alcoholic drinks or water were available to them, they, like their human counterparts, abstained from drinking until it was time to sleep. As with many people of the Western culture, they had an alcoholic drink before retiring. From time to time, people in the societies where alcohol is widely used throw parties, drink a lot, and have hangovers. So with the rats. Occasionally the bar became a place for a drinking party. All rats joined in for this open house. As with human beings after a particularly hectic drinking party, the rats spent some days recovering, not touching alcohol, and imbibing quantities of water. Humans say that they drink alcohol to reduce tension, to be sociable, to do business with their fellow drinkers, to avoid loneliness, and so on. Can it be the same with rats? Hardly. The explanation seems that some social behavior, at least, is rooted in the animal level of behavior. Science. Question: are you opposed to scientists? Answer: no. But I am opposed to scientists not being what they think they are. I once went to a lecture concerned with blood transfusions, attended by a scientific audience, with a Sufi friend. The lecturer spoke disparagingly of the lingering folklore beliefs among ordinary people, and how scientists should work against these. My friend requested permission to ask a question. When he was given it, he turned to the audience and asked them how many knew to which blood group they belonged. 1/4 raised their arms. When asked which of them knew their astrological sun sign, everyone did. Reality and imagination. Question: are people really as stupid as the Sufis make out? If they were, how could society function as well as it does? How can one test whether people really do behave in such an absurd manner as some of the people in Sufi stories and teaching narratives do? Answer: people really are as stupid as the Sufis make out. Society works as well as it does because not everyone is stupid all the time. The Sufi enterprise helps them by showing up stupidity to forestall its appearance at times when it blocks understanding. There is little need to test whether people really do behave as the ones in stories and narratives, because the newspapers are full of accounts of this behavior, and hence it is displayed everywhere all the time. You do not need, after all, to test whether a cherry is red. You can see it easily once you know what red is. There are, however, many people who like, for one reason or another, to demonstrate human stupidity. Yaroslav Hasek, author of The Good Soldier Shrike, was one of these. He wrote an article in a zoological journal, which was highly thought of, asserting that elephants liked recorded music while tigers did not. When he published a treatise on prehistoric fossilized fleas, it was such a success that many European learned journals reprinted it. When he advertised thoroughbred werewolves for sale, he was inundated with orders for them. He put on a police uniform and told the rector of a Prague academy that he was under arrest, whereupon the man obediently followed him to a police station. By these means, Hasek showed that people will obey the symbols of authority, that they accept what is written in academic journals, that they will accept even werewolves if they are offered them, that they will publish tripe at the drop of a hat. And may I ask you a question? If people were not as stupid as they are made out to be, would they tolerate the kinds of individuals and organizations which exploit them? Who votes for the lying and improbable politicians who, remember, actually rule over so many of us? Confusion of superficial and perceptive. Question: the appreciation of art must surely be a higher perceptive function. When Sufis speak of the secondary self, which is composed mainly of the emotional and the learnt, do they not use the artistic sense to break through that barrier, testifying as it does to images and values far beyond the superficial? Surely everyone is agreed that artistic perception is on a much higher level than lower ones. Answer: theoretically this seems to be true. The Sufis say, however, that what most people take to be art is not art at all, but emotional and conditioned sources of stimuli. This does not mean that there is no real art. It does mean that Sufis hold that even acceptedly aesthetic people have confused learnt and automatic responses with perception. Question: this sounds very much like a posture to me. After all, how can Sufis establish that art experts are superficial? Answer: Sufis do not have to establish it, as it has already been established by the art experts themselves. You will recall in my Learning How to Learn how a man who wanted to get rid of the crowd around Van Gogh's paintings carved something out of corned beef and mounted it as Van Gogh's ear, and by this stratagem attracted the art lovers away from the paintings. This was a proof that art lovers, among whom were surely some experts, were more interested in what was in fact corned beef than in what was acceptedly art. But if you want a further example, there is one of Sunset over the Adriatic, exhibited in 1910 at the Salon des Indépendants, painted by Borinali. An Austrian collector bought the canvas after it had received acclaim by the experts as an outstanding example of the excessivist school. It was then revealed by Roland de Georges and a group of artists that the picture had been painted by a donkey to whose tail a brush had been tied. Borinali was formed by a rearrangement of the letters in the name of Ali Boron, the donkey in La Fontaine. Matisse's painting Le Bateau was hung for 47 days at the Museum of Modern Art in 1961, when about 120,000 people saw it without realizing that it was upside down. There are many true stories of this kind, which surely go far enough to establish that artistic appreciation and higher perception are not connected in the kind of art which is generally regarded as such. No, what is currently considered to be art does not belong to anything higher than emotion and implanted belief, and this has already been well illustrated, no matter what people may imagine. I have myself, in a certain artist's studio, witnessed a crowd of distinguished visitors, including eminent critics, rapturous over a bundle of rags which, as the embarrassed master painter confessed, were the pieces of cloth on which he wiped his brushes, and not works of art at all. So the conclusion seems to be the very reverse of what you believe. It is possible to illustrate that what is thought of as artistic appreciation is superficial, or at least is dependent upon unreliable feelings and social pressure. If it were to be held that there is something higher in artistic experience, the onus would be on those who claimed it to show that they have excluded these easily demonstrated subjective reactions. Real and unreal. Question: in Learning How to Learn, you write vigorously against such things as dressing up in ridiculous clothes and carrying out absurd exercises and watching fictional spectacles, plus being fascinated by distorted history. Now surely there is a strong interest in reality and in real life, even the most banal forms of these. Surely this is an excellent parallel to help to bring people to an interest in the true reality, which lies beyond ordinary reality, and which is the most real of all. What about the people who watch, for instance, documentary programs on television? Answer: I am glad that you asked that. A taste for reality is certainly a motif of a taste for objective reality, so that comparative reality, ordinary life, is a first step. After that comes the showing that ordinary life is not real, but perceived subjectively. But people have not yet become as accustomed as you may imagine to seeking reality. They still seek fantasy much more. I am not against fantasy, but I say that the search for too much fantasy at the expense of reality gives an unbalanced intake. If there are 3 concurrent television programs, which of them will get the largest audiences? The one which features bizarre dress and strange physical actions? The one which presents a human life? Or the one which is an emotionally charged costume drama? What proportion of each will the programs win? I will not ask you to guess at the figures, for the result will embarrass you. We have got some figures on this. The Paris newspaper François carried out a survey of viewing habits. They held a poll to see which of the following was being watched one night, and in what proportions. 1. It's a knockout with a mixture of sport and bizarre dress. 2. An historical costume drama. And 3. A documentary about the life of a woman. Here are the results. Percentage of viewers watching It's a Knockout, 33%. Costume drama, 67%. Woman's life, 0. Yes, I said 0. Disreputable. Question. I see that such writers as Norman Cohn, in his book The Pursuit of the Millennium, ascribe the rise of Christian sects wandering about and proclaiming the direct influence of God to Sufis and Sufism. He speaks of their debauchery and habit of eating revolting foodstuffs, and states that they reached Europe and influenced it from Muslim Spain. This is not the behavior which most people associate with Sufis. Answer. Cohn says that Sufism seems to have assisted the growth of the free spirit in Christian Europe. Certainly every one of the features that characterized Sufism in 12th century Spain, even to such details as the parti-coloured robes, were to be noted as typical of the adepts of the free spirit a century or two later. All publicly manifested activities and some others have their imitators. The lunatics who go about India and the West aping what they take to be the behaviour of Hindus influence other people. Are we therefore to say that these people represent Hindu influence? The cannibal who always said grace before eating people because missionaries had taught him to do so should not surely be considered without qualification as a Christian, or even under Christian influence. But your point is interesting, because we have a very similar development in the West today. Parallel with an increase in real Sufic activity, there are bands of people roaming the streets and filling the halls, enrolling disciples and generally claiming to be Sufis or pretending to be such. They will, in turn, have many imitators. But the features that characterize Sufism are not those which can be imitated, so Professor Cohn is being somewhat superficial here. Such cults represent the deterioration of Sufi behavior. They come about by the interaction between unstable imitators, would-be teachers, and emotion-starved, temporarily insane people, would-be disciples. What it really meant. Question. Modern science and contemporary ways of looking at things have enabled us to solve many mysteries of the past. The written records of the Sufis, admittedly, are often obscure because they are presented in a special way. But surely present-day scholars can decipher them when they know the point of view of the writers. Answer. Sufi writings are not all encoded. They depend, as often as not, upon someone having a certain experience before he can really understand them. And there are problems when you call in the experts, as a number of reputable scholars found out with a certain inscription not so long ago. One day, a small boy found a stone sticking out from the ground when he was crossing a field in southern Ireland. One side was smooth, the other had an inscription. This he showed to his local schoolmaster, who sent it to the university. There scholars became excited. One found that it was written in Hebrew, and he translated it as a warning of invaders who were to come. Another, however, was equally certain that it was inscribed in ancient Norse, and told of a battle against wild men after the writer had been shipwrecked. That is, until an ordinary student looked at it with the sun shining upon it at an angle. Then the message stood out clearly. It was in English and no more than 150 years old. It said simply, June 1788. Am very drunk again this day. You will find this recorded in Frank Edwards's Stranger Than Fiction, London 1963, Handbooks, pages 136 to 137. Who can learn? Question. Again and again the Sufis claim that people do not register truth, and that the ordinary mind is not reliable. But surely all our knowledge of life and of ourselves is based on a reliable understanding of facts. Surely Sufis are only talking about a minority of people. If they are, why bother with them? Answer. On the contrary, Sufis are talking here about a majority of people. It is interesting to note that it is only lately that others are catching up with this very great problem. I call it a problem because if it is true that people ordinarily are prone to considerable mistakes in perception and understanding, and are easily misled by wrong information, then this stands, as the Sufis say, as a barrier to real understanding. This has been demonstrated again and again. On television, in one program as an example, it was shown that people hardly ever know what they have seen. As eyewitnesses, humans are in the disaster class. From 525 questions asked of witnesses to staged events, only 52, 1 in 10, were correct, and this from a selection of people who had been alerted to watch for something and still could not see it. The social consequences might include people being imprisoned on inaccurate eyewitness testimony. The consequence for the perception of things which are there in a higher sense are what the Sufis talk about. This opens the question of who can learn and what is a student. Again, people ask for truth, but advertisers has shown that truth does not sell goods. A study presented before the American Marketing Association showed that truthful advertisements fail, but lying ones succeed in putting people into a buying mood. In supposedly religious matters which have been shown to be early examples of advertising, the same picture emerges. The Glastonbury legends, in which, among other things, Christ himself appeared and dedicated a church, are only one example. Supposed to start from AD 63, the scheme was in reality started as a fundraising ploy in 1184, 1,121 years after the supposed events, by the monks whose buildings had been destroyed by a fire. Does anyone believe that supposed events of over 1,000 years ago, first published today as true fact, should receive any credence? This human tendency has actually been tested. The BBC Two television man Tony Bilbo hoaxed viewers by saying that he had obtained film clips of The Great Pismo and showed forgeries of the film. Then, everybody began to remember the Great Pismo when he made his television debut. Letters piled into the BBC praising the 1920s comedian. A woman wrote enthusiastically, "My aunt was a great fan of the Great Pismo. She saw him at a show in Hastings." She added, "What a pity he was not recognized on television before she died in 1957. One man even sent in photographs of the Great Pismo's father. After all that, could one doubt that he ever existed? It is precisely because of the unreliability of vision, of memory, of wanting to believe, of induced belief, whether in religion, in motor accidents, or in the lives of invented individuals, that the Sufis say that an objective perception must be acquired before even familiar things can be seen as they are. What do you really know? Question. The sensitivity of people towards animals must surely help them to understand higher things, especially the ability of animal lovers to perceive directly the ways of their pets. Answer: that is quite true. However, before you attribute this ability to all animal lovers, consider what a number of cat fanciers thought about cats. They were asked: 1. Are cats lone animals? 2. Do they form gangs, especially the males? 3. Do dominant males challenge others for the favours of the females? 4. Do they invariably react against intrusion of other cats into their territory? 5. Do dominant cats try to drive weaker ones from the latter's territory? And 6. Are some domestic cats unable to kill? Out of these 6 questions, asked from 100 cat fanciers, each person got every answer wrong. The answers, by the way, are questions 1, 3, 4 and 5, no, questions 2 and 6, yes. This research by Professor Paul Lehauser of the West German Max Planck Institute showed that people may think that they know about animals, but do they? Similarly, what people think that they know, even thinking that they know it by observation and even experience about other things, such as psychological and religious matters, can often be seen to be fragmentary, misplaced, selectively adopted. If people could rely upon themselves to learn by themselves, they would not need teaching. They wouldn't even need scientific verifications of fact to correct them, because their beliefs would be based on accurate information, since they would either observe correctly from the beginning or else reject inaccurate information. So before we get to the point of the value of the knowledge, we must be sure that it is really there. Human nature. Question: the Sufis often condemn heedlessness, irrelevance, and confusion, and insist that these things have to be set aside since they interfere with higher perceptions, keeping people asleep for practical purposes. But are those characteristics manifested in ordinary life? And if they are, how do they affect us? If so, is this an analogy of the barriers to higher understanding? Answer: I should have thought that any of these factors would interfere with the effectiveness of almost anything in ordinary life. But that they are part of ordinary human behavior has been tested. A recent example is the nature of inventors and the characteristics of those whom they have to deal with in the matter of inventions. When the journal New Scientist carried out an investigation into the question, it was able to publish results which showed that this is a general human problem. The inventors were frequently irrelevant, confused, and impatient. Some tried to patent inventions that nobody wanted because they were doing something which was already done. Some let their patents lapse. They wrote letters which could hardly be read, which dealt with divorce, illness, burglary, and surgery, as well as the invention supposedly under discussion. Sometimes, when asked about one invention, they would answer about another. They changed their addresses without informing the patents office, so they could not be contacted. The reaction to inventions was just as bad, or worse. Major official and other entities completely misunderstood inventions, although they were supposed to be evaluating them. Some organizations did not like them when they had not been carried out by their own staff. Some people liked inventions but did not believe that they would work, though they could not say why. Some of the reasons why inventions were turned down were obviously absurd. One invention which saves lives after cardiac arrest, for instance, was disliked because the release of an air valve made a hissing sound. the minister at the Department of Health completely misunderstood one remarkable invention to prevent suicide or accidental death through introducing emetics into tablets. People felt that their empire would be threatened by the acceptance of an outside invention. The press preferred lamenting the increase in car thefts to featuring an invention to frustrate them. And in the case of the same invention, everyone approached thought it so simple that it could not work. Here we have the classic working of the major human, normal methods of thinking and acting, or not acting. Laziness, stupidity, incredulity, fear of upsetting the status quo, obstructionism, timidity, irrelevance and confusion, and so on. It should be remembered that when the ordinary human being is approached with an idea, or series of ideas, or a teaching, he or she will often respond in just this same way. It is because of this that people with new things to say have resorted to arousing the greed of whomever they are approaching. This succeeds in increasing the greed and preventing the development of any side of the character or of the proposal which is not connected with greed. There is not only an analogy with higher understanding here. Before we get to that, we have to deal with the barriers erected by the lower understanding, which often cannot be described as understanding at all. The Sufi perception of these problems has been continually and solidly represented for centuries. The Sufi activity is designed to get past these barriers by the methods indicated to outmaneuver the commanding self, which is the complex of reactions involved when presenting advanced ideas to ordinary people and organizations. This experience with an easily studied area of human activity startlingly illustrates how humanity is asleep. New knowledge from old. Question: by what method do the Sufis extract information of value to present-day psychology and higher knowledge from ancient written materials? For my own part, I can only see the ordinary meaning in such texts. Answer: this is an interesting question, and the only way to answer it is to say that one has to have specialized knowledge and also experience. But it may be possible to make the process clearer by means of an analogy. Assume that there is a water source which seems unexpectedly to be harming crops. An expert is called in, and he realizes that there is zeolite in the water, and that it is no longer active. He also knows that salt can regenerate it by means of the following formula. Calcium zeolite plus 2 sodium chloride gives sodium zeolite plus calcium chloride. He adds salt to the water, and the phenomenon of ion exchange is achieved. So we need a chemist. Now, if you are still with me, consider the following passage from the Old Testament, from 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 19 to 21. And the men of the city said unto Elisha, Behold, I pray thee, the situation of this city is pleasant, and as my Lord seeth, but the water is naught, and the ground barren. And he said, Bring me a new cruse, and put salt therein. And they brought it to him. And he went forth unto the spring of the waters, and cast the salt in there, and said, Thus saith the Lord, I have healed these waters, there shall not be from thence any more death or barren land. It is difficult to imagine that Elisha is not demonstrating chemical knowledge in performing ion exchange. If you did not know something about chemistry, the story might make an interesting read about a miracle. On the other hand, if you did, it makes, for some at least, an even more interesting account of information. You may be interested to know that the chemical nature of this biblical tale, reaching beyond its supposed miracle status, was analyzed by Professor Yahya Hashmi, an illustrious scientist and Sufi authority of the Aleppo Society for Scientific Research in Syria in 1962. Floor covering. Question. I was interested to read in the press that you are reported as having said that institutions, far from giving a guarantee of rationality because they are subject to assessment and measurement, equally often, or more frequently, enshrine irrationality. But surely, whereas a quasi-institution like a commercial company may behave eccentrically because of the wishes of, say, the directors, this is not the case in more coherent bodies like government departments, where there is a public check. Answer. The tendency is everywhere. Rather than my wasting your time with numerous examples, I think that it would be worth your while to seek such anomalies yourself. They are to be found in the newspapers, if you have no direct contacts to supply them. Here is just one. The New Scientist reported on the 29th of March 1979 that the following figures had been given in the British Parliament for the underfoot floor covering supplied by the government for various kinds of people in its employ. Typists, £25, clerical officers, £30, senior executive officers, £67, under-secretaries, £181, deputy secretary, £290. There is no evidence that deputy secretaries' office floors get harder treatment than under-secretaries. Indeed, there is nothing to show that such carpets are harder wearing, only that they are more expensive. We all know, of course, that a better carpet is a hallowed privilege, and that people are reprimanded for using their own rugs if this seemed to indicate a higher status. But where does the rug as an indicator of status connect with the rationality expected from an institution? Economics. Question. Although, as we know, most Sufi activity down the ages has been private rather than public, and Sufis do not primarily wish to attract attention to themselves, there is undoubtedly evidence of a massive investment of people and resources in Sufi teaching. Apart from the scholars, who are subsidized by universities, and the cultists, who are self-financing as they grow in numbers, there are the Sufi activities which appear full-blown, and which are always seen to be immensely efficient and well-funded. What makes it worthwhile for the Sufis to engage in such enormous investments? Answer. Sufi activity is, of course, to be expressed more in terms of less impressive-looking things than material investment. But as you have raised the matter, you might care to look at it in this way, by pursuing your own line of thought. We can take the smallpox eradication program of the United Nations as an equivalence. This started in 1968 and lasted for a decade. The United States alone contributed $2.6 million a year towards the effort, $26 million over the 10 years, in which the disease was eliminated. Now, many people imagined that this money was lost, was of the nature of charity to the Third World, and some wondered whether it could not be better used in the USA itself. Why do we spend such massive sums on people who often don't behave properly? It was asked. Dr. L.B. Brilliant of the World Health Organization's smallpox eradication program, however, has revealed that the United States of America alone gains over $300 million each year in savings on her protection of the American people against smallpox. Others calculate the saving as being in excess of $450 million, again, annually. So your word investment is correct. Sufis invest partly to protect the people against the absence of Sufic activity and consequent impoverishment of the people, and partly in order to inoculate the people against cults and conditioning, and partly to bring the advantages of the Sufi enterprise to the people who can benefit from them. Similarly, too, people who contribute to Sufi entities also help to prevent things getting worse, and they also help to make it impossible for things ever to be as bad again as they once were. Invention versus development. Question. British people constantly complain that, although they invent some of the most wonderful things, they hardly ever develop them, and the result is that technical devices all over the world are of British origin, while engineers and scientists of other nations adapt and market them. What can be done about this, and what is its relevance to higher human capacities? Answer. I have heard this constantly, about antibiotics, about jet engines, about hovercraft, and so on. People love to complain about it in speeches, and it is part of a refrain seen in the newspapers. The implication is that if one could only develop a better planning and vision sense, all would be well. Before looking at this problem, I think that it is worth paying attention to what an Englishman said after considering the whole phenomenon. He told me, "A Frenchman, a German, and an Englishman were being taken to be hanged. The Frenchman was first, and the trapdoor did not work. He was reprieved on the grounds that nobody could be hanged twice. Fate had intervened. The same thing happened to the German. As the Englishman was being taken for his turn, he was asked if he had any last words. 'Yes,' he said, 'you need a bit of grease on the hinges.'" The joke itself is remarkably diagnostic of the mentality in question. The man knows what should be done, but is unable to relate it to his own needs. He is unable, too, to keep his mouth shut, even when his life is at stake. This, in turn, highlights the problem. If human beings are dependent upon invention and the development of inventions without any question as to what kinds of inventions, when and where, would be of any far-reaching value, then those who invent will have to learn how to develop, and those who develop should also learn to invent, if this kind of thing is to be kept going satisfactorily to such a mechanistic view of life. But what about the matter of what kind of inventions and what kind of development? For this, higher knowledge is necessary. Deterrent. Question. I can't understand how it can be true that real Sufi teachings contain elements which deter unsuitable people from going deeper into the subject on a deliberate basis. Surely the intention of the Sufis, like that of everyone having something good to share, is to interest as many people as possible and to improve people by means of their literature, not to deflect them. Answer. People are always writing to other people claiming that they can't understand this or that. Now, if they do not understand it, this is merely a statement of the reader's condition. It is not a question. If, on the other hand, the individual means that he does not want to believe it, we might try to give an answer. I choose to interpret this question in that way. On the social level, people often make themselves obnoxious to others to prevent them from trying to become too friendly, if they do not like them. Do you imagine that something which can operate on such a crude level cannot be worked on a higher one? Rumi, for instance, constantly assails scholars and shows them up as much more stupid than they imagine themselves to be. This deters few scholars. They continue to write and lecture about Rumi and his work. But it gives the ordinary person an opportunity to see the absurdity of the situation, scholars repeating their own shortcomings and continuing to do Rumi's work after 700 years. In assuming that the Sufis want to share and interest as many people as possible, you are confusing them with enthusiast cultists and people who count heads. The Sufis want to share, but they have to share with those who can profit from the sharing, and can therefore continue the process of sharing with others to come. This requires the Sufis using their energy in teaching how to learn before any sharing can take place. Sharing the sheer sensation of importance or of being a human being, or even a servant of humanity, can be done by anyone, and is the sort of sharing that people are always straining towards. But the minimum human duty is to serve others. It is no great attainment. Feeling important is a vice, not a virtue, however concealed as participation in something noble. Finally, note what New Jersey park officials in the USA have done with Christmas trees. So many people were stealing them that they are now sprayed with a chemical which gives off an offensive smell when the tree is put in a warm place. Thieves learn to avoid these trees for this reason. If this can be done with plants, why not with books? And in the case of a book, or a man's behavior even, you don't have to ruin the book or waste the man's contact, as you have to ruin the Christmas trees of New Jersey, to teach the can't understanders a lesson. Cause and effect. Question: why do Sufis sometimes do inexplicable things? I have heard of them forbidding people to eat certain food, or telling them to go to certain places, or even saying outrageous things which people puzzle over for years. Answer: imitators do these things to impress. Real Sufis do them because of a knowledge of cause and effect. Most people have no idea that the most trivial-seeming actions may have extremely far-reaching effects. Only occasionally are cause and effect seen in a short run within a contracted timescale, giving an equivalence of what we are talking about. There is the case, to take one almost at random, of the wine and the finger. The French playwright Victorien Sardou was sitting at table during a dinner when he upset a glass of wine. A lady by his side, to prevent the liquid staining the cloth, poured salt on it. Spilt salt to some people means bad luck. To counteract this, a pinch is thrown over the shoulder, and Sardou did just this. The salt got into the eyes of the waiter who was trying to serve him, and the chicken on the plate which he held fell to the ground. The dog of the house started to gobble the chicken, and a bone lodged in its throat so that it began to choke. The hostess's son tried to get the bone out of the dog's throat. Now the dog turned on the youth and bit his finger so hard that it had to be amputated. The waiter, the dog, and the son of the house were all acting automatically through the secondary self, a mixture of greed, hope, fear, and conditioning. Only the woman acted for practical reasons, but her attempt to retrieve the situation was foiled by the playwright, whose second action, throwing the salt over his shoulder, set the whole train of actions going. False masters. Question: why are there so many false spiritual teachers around? Answer: this is one of the most common questions, and there are almost as many answers as there are people asking. When there is a true or useful thing, there is sure to be a counterfeit. This does not mean that the original intention was bad, but things turn out bad if they are not properly organized. There is no difference between this problem and the one of the lovelorn Taiwanese. There was once a young man of Taiwan who desperately desired that a certain girl should marry him. He wrote her letters over a period of 2 years, an average of 1 a day, declaring his love. This continued, says the United Press, from 1972 to 1976. Without that effort, it is unlikely that the lady would have become engaged, in the way she did, to the postman who delivered the letters. Troubadours. Question: I have heard it said repeatedly that such groupings as the troubadours were engaged in religious enlightenment programs, but I cannot see how. After all, they were amusing people with their songs and poems. Surely this is part of what you have called the entertainment industry, and would not bring anyone to enlightenment any more than sacred dances or self-centered prayer. Answer: there is a restaurant in New York to which a kind friend took me. The waiters there entertain the children with balloons and songs and doing a Pied Piper act around the tables. Does this make anyone imagine that they are not waiters at all? A moment's observation shows that, in addition to this entertainment function, they are indeed workers, bringing food to the tables. The fact is that Sufi activities may contain entertainment value, but they have something else as well, just as an orange has flavor and nutrition. This is not widely understood only because people are in fact looking for entertainment, or else to denigrate it, they are not looking for fact. Here is a tale which may fix this in your mind. A man used to stand outside the window of a beautiful girl, playing the guitar and serenading her. Someone asked, "Why do you not ask her to marry you?" He said, "I have thought of that, but if she agreed, what would I do with my evenings?"